Have you logged into a computer today, ridden in a car, gotten dressed? Chances are all these items have one thing in common. They or some of their components were made outside of the United States. And if you ever go to visit another country, you'd probably find things there that were made in the United States. Why don't we produce everything that we need just in the United States? And why don't other countries do the same? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, is why is it that nations trade? We talked before about the different types of resources or factors of production that go into making a product. Things like natural resources, which are things like arable land, mineral deposits, oil and gas deposits, water, and raw materials like timber. Human capital, which is knowledge and skills gained by a worker through education and experience. Every job requires some sort of human capital. And physical capital, the tools and machines that we use to make our products, things like tractors and factories. Now the thing is that these different resources are not equally distributed throughout the world. Some countries are full of lots of natural resources, like the United States. We have huge deposits of many great resources. Other countries, like maybe Hong Kong, don't have a lot of resources, natural resources to speak of. Human capital. If you go back to different countries, some countries have a lot of human capital, meaning that their workforce is very educated and has a lot of knowledge and specialized skills to complete jobs. Others don't. And same with physical capital. Some countries have more resources to build more factories or tractors or all the different things they need to make goods and services. And so because of this unequal resource distribution, we're going to see that international trade is actually essential to increasing our standard of living. Absolute advantage is when a country can produce more of a given amount of product. When you were younger, you might have said to a friend, "My dad's better than your dad. My dad can do more push-ups than your dad could do." What you were bragging about was absolute advantage. You were saying that he could produce more of a given amount of product. Perhaps you said, "Well, my dad can run a mile faster than your dad." Well, again, that's still absolute advantage because you're doing, with the same amount of resource, you're doing it faster. So absolute advantage can be about making more of a product or making it faster. Comparative advantage is when a country can produce this product with a smaller opportunity cost. Remember what opportunity cost is. It's the cost of the next best thing you give up. So whenever a country chooses to make a product, let's say an iPod, there's another product it's not making with that time, and that other product is its opportunity cost. We have comparative advantage when we have the smallest opportunity cost in making a product. It means we give up the least. Well, let's do an example. You may have heard of the Hatfields and McCoys. They were engaged in 100 years or more of feuding. Well, let's say the Hatfield McCoys sat down and tried to determine if they should let bygones be bygones and give up their war in order to engage in trade. Would it be beneficial to them? Well, let's say that in order to make 1 bushel of corn, the Hatfields spent 8 hours. And in order to make 1 bushel of cloth, the Hatfields spent 10 hours. The McCoys, to make 1 bushel of corn, it took them 15 hours. And to make 1 yard of cloth, it took them 12 hours. Who has absolute advantage in corn? Who can make 1 bushel of corn fastest? The Hatfields. Who has absolute advantage in cloth? Meaning who can make it fastest? The Hatfields. Well, if you're looking at this, you might start thinking, well, there'd be no benefit for the Hatfields to do any trading because they're better at everything anyway. They have absolute advantage. Well, let's see if this is true. To produce corn and cloth, the Hatfields must spend a total of 18 hours working, 8 hours for corn and 10 hours for cloth. To produce corn and cloth, the McCoys must spend 27 hours working, 15 hours spent making their bushel of corn and 12 hours making their yard of cloth. Well, what if they did something a little different? What if the Hatfields just made 2 bushels of corn. So they specialized, made one thing. And then they traded for their cloth. Well, if they were making 2 bushels of corn, they would spend 16 hours working, and they could trade 1 bushel of corn for 1 yard of cloth, and they still wouldn't have spent any more than 16 hours. And so they would get 1 bushel of corn and 1 yard of cloth for 16 hours of work. The McCoys, what if they just made 2 yards of cloth and traded for their corn? Well, they would be spending 24 hours of work time. They would make their 2 yards of cloth, which would take them 24 hours, and they would trade one of those yards of cloth for a bushel of corn. Do you notice what's happened? The Hatfields used to spend 18 hours working, but now to get the same amount of goods, they are only spending 16 hours of work. The McCoys used to spend 27 hours working, and now they're only spending 24 hours working. Both the Hatfields and McCoys, they both benefited, even though the Hatfields were better at everything to begin with. This is called the law of comparative advantage. The law of comparative advantage says a nation is better off when it produces the goods and services for which it has comparative advantage, for which it has the smallest opportunity costs. I'll show you later how to use the numbers that we just looked at to figure out, just numerically, which group has comparative advantage between two products. This is the reason why specialization works so well. Specialization leads often to a better standard of living. It leads to more efficiency, to resources being used in a better way. Specialization is when we specialize in making a certain good or service. Now, this has all been assuming that we have what we call free trade, meaning that there are no rules, nothing preventing people from trading. But often countries engage in what we call trade barriers. And trade barriers, there are many different kinds. I'm just going to focus on 3, are things that countries use in order to protect trade or protect certain industries in their country. It's a means of preventing a foreign product or service from freely entering a nation's territory. Trade barriers take 3 common forms: import quotas, voluntary export restraints, and tariffs. Import quotas limit the amount that can be imported. So, for example, we may tell Japan, you can import a certain number of Toyotas, and that's it. We don't let them go over that number. Another idea might be a voluntary export restraint. A voluntary export restraint is a self-imposed limitation on the number of products shipped to a particular country. So this would be if Toyota itself said, okay, we're only going to ship this many cars to your country. And they're doing it on their own, hoping that if they limit it to some extent, we won't make an import quota on them. We won't put one on them that might be even more restrictive than what they'll put on themselves. The last one is a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. So for every Toyota that's brought to America, perhaps we would charge them $100 or $500 or some certain amount. Of course, each one of these things, these trade barriers, has an effect on our economy. One thing, what it does mostly, is it limits the supply. All these things are meant to do that. But because supply is limited, it means that prices will be more expensive for the product, which again is one of the intended effects, because the idea is to increase the price of a Toyota so that more Fords will be sold. Also, it leads to less competition and less incentives, meaning that if we don't have to worry about the better, if cars, let's say, are made better in Japan or another country, if we could just bring their price up, then they won't compete with us as much, and we don't have to make our cars better. And finally, sometimes this can lead to trade wars. Trade wars are like escalating economic conflict in which one country restricts imports and the other country says, okay, well now we're going to restrict the things that you send us. And they go back and forth, and both countries can be very affected very negatively because of this. There are certainly arguments for and against free trade. Many people believe in something called protectionism. Protectionism is the use of trade barriers to protect industries from foreign competition. And so specifically we use them so that we won't have as much competition in our jobs. Um, People who are for protectionism say that it protects jobs, that it would keep people from losing jobs in their home regions. It also, another reason that people give for protectionism is that it can protect infant industries. Now, this isn't industries for babies. It means industries that are babies themselves, that have just started to grow, and that they need time and they need practice to become efficient. But if we let other countries who maybe are already better at this product compete with us, we'll never get a chance to grow. And the third may be to safeguard national security. Even those people who are supporters of free trade agree that some industries do need to be protected. Things like steel, for example. We don't want to get all our steel from other countries because if we had a war or something like that, we would need steel and other products from heavy industries. So we want to make sure that we always have a working steel industry in our country. People who are against protectionism say that free trade brings better living standards. If we take advantage of comparative advantage, as we looked through the Hatfield and McCoy example, we can have more. Also, it can lead to more international peace. If every country is trading with each other, we have a big incentive to not fight each other.